They say the eyes are windows to the soul, but for Aurelia Darkwater, her eyes were a death sentence. To look into her pitch-black irises was to stare into a void that the Darkwater pack believed consumed the very spirit of anyone nearby. This superstition cost Aurelia everything. In a heartbeat of violence, she watched the pack enforcer, Thane Bloodclaw, execute her parents for the crime of harboring a dark omen, leaving a 10-year-old girl to be cast into the dead zone, a wasteland where life goes to wither. Now, Aurelia survives as a soul mender, her skin stained a permanent, bruised gray from physically absorbing the agonizing illnesses of a pack that hates her for pennies. She is a woman carrying the world's pain on her back, a ghost in a land of monsters. But when a harmonic, glass-shattering cry echoes through the barrens, Aurelia's mender sense screams with a white-hot agony she cannot ignore. A golden cub, the secret heir to the throne, is being erased from existence, and Aurelia is the only one who can take his death into her own body. Crafting these 45-minute cinematic stories involves hours of research into lore and weeks of custom writing to ensure every emotional beat hits home. If you appreciate the effort our team puts into these tales of justice and redemption, please consider subscribing. It's a small, free gesture for you, but it's the only reason we can keep these stories alive. The camera pulls in tight, suffocatingly close on Aurelia Darkwater's eyes. They are not merely dark, they're absolute, two infinite wells of pitch black that seem to draw the very light from the room. In the reflection of those void-like irises, the past flickers like a dying candle. We see the flash of a silver blade, the spray of crimson on fresh snow, and the snarling face of Thane Bloodclaw. The scream of a 10-year-old girl echoes over the image of her parents falling, their life force extinguished for the crime of loving a child born with a dark omen. The vision snaps shut. We are in the present, in a shack that is more mud than timber, huddled in the shadow of the dead zone. Aurelia stands over a steaming pot, her movements slow and heavy. Her skin is a map of suffering. It is a mottled, bruised gray, a condition known as pain saturation. As a soul mender, she does not just heal, she absorbs. Every fracture she has mended for a passing traveler, every fever she has sucked out of a dying exile, lives within her pores. She is a woman made of other people's agony, a ghost walking the border of a world that fears her. Crafting these 45-minute cinematic stories involves hours of research into lore and weeks of custom writing to ensure every emotional beat hits home. If you appreciate the effort our team puts into these tales of justice and redemption, please consider subscribing. It's a small, free gesture for you, but it's the only reason we can keep these stories alive. The Dead Zone is a monument to the cruelty of High Alpha Balthasar Grimwald. It was his hand that signed the Purity Edict, a decree that mandated the immediate exile or execution of any wolf possessing spectral deformities. To Balthasar, Aurelia is not a person. She is a statistical error, a nobody whose existence is a stain on the pack's perceived perfection. Here, in this wasteland of dust and dry bone, Aurelia is the only thing that stands between the unwanted and the grave. She works for pennies, absorbing the rot of a society that would cheer if she simply stopped breathing. The heavy silence of the wasteland is suddenly shattered. It isn't the howl of a wolf or the roar of a predator. It is a harmonic, glass-shattering cry that vibrates through the very marrow of Aurelia's bones. It sounds like a star falling to earth. Aurelia's staff clatters to the dirt floor, forgotten. Her mender sense, usually a dull throb of collective pain, flares into a white-hot, agonizing scream. Somewhere nearby, a life of immense, solar power is being systematically erased. It is a life-siphon, a trap so cruel it makes her own saturation feel like a mercy. She doesn't think of the Purity Edict. She doesn't think of the enforcer who took her parents or the alpha who signed her death warrant. She only thinks of that sound, the sound of a soul being shredded. Aurelia bolts from the shack, her ragged cloak snapping in the wind as she runs toward a certain death, driven by a gift the world has called a curse. If you were Aurelia, would you help a pack that had already taken everything from you? Type help or run in the comments. We're reading them all. The dead zone was a place of muted colors, but the clearing ahead pulsed with a sickening, artificial violet light. Aurelia broke through the jagged brush to find the golden cub suspended in midair, held by a web of jagged obsidian spikes. This was Fenrir Shadowbane's mana trap, a masterpiece of cruelty designed to slowly shave the soul from a living body. Two of Shadowbane's elite assassins stood nearby, their laughter like the scraping of flint. They watched as the cub's solar glow flickered, savoring the way the prince's light dimmed with every harmonic pulse of the spikes. "Look at it," one of the assassins sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "The Sun Prince, reduced to a dying ember. Fenrir will be pleased to know the wool heartline ends in a ditch." Aurelia didn't wait. She stepped into the violet light, her staff gripped so hard her knuckles turned white. The assassins turned, their eyes widening at the sight of her pitch-black irises. "Avoid mender," the second one spat, drawing a silver-edged blade. "You should have stayed in your shack, witch. You're too gray and too late." The fight was neither graceful nor clean. Aurelia was not a warrior, but she was a vessel of 7 years of unbridled agony. As the assassins lunged, she unleashed her pain release. It was a visceral, psychic shockwave, the stored trauma of every broken bone and burning fever she had ever absorbed, expelled all at once. The first assassin collapsed instantly, his mind buckling under the weight of 1,000 strangers' torments. But the second was faster. He drove his silver blade deep into Aurelia's ribs, the metal hissing as it met her saturated flesh. A normal wolf would have died before the blade was even withdrawn. But the void nature within Aurelia was a hungry thing. It held her together through sheer, stubborn darkness. She didn't fall. She gripped the assassin's wrist, looking into his eyes with her own black depths until he fled into the forest, screaming in terror. Silence rushed back into the clearing, heavy and absolute. Aurelia staggered to the cub. The trap had done its work. The golden cub was cold. Its solar heart finally stopped. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the matted gold fur. To save a royal was to die, but to save a child was the only thing that made her curse worth the wait. She began the final transference. The air grew stagnant as she poured her entire soul, every memory, every spark of life, every drop of the immortality seed in her blood into the cub. Black veins of void rot began to crawl up her neck, a visual manifestation of the darkness, claiming the vacancy she was creating. As her own heart slowed to a crawl, the cub began to transform. The dull gray of death receded, replaced by a brilliant, blinding gold that illuminated the falling snow. Aurelia collapsed beside him, her breathing a ragged, wet rattle. The void rot had reached her jaw, and the world was fading to a peaceful, silent gray. She leaned down, her lips brushing the cub's ear one last time. "Be the king I never had," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. She closed her eyes, welcoming the cold of the dead zone as the blizzard began to cover her body, a final shroud for a woman the world had never wanted to see. Should a healer have to sacrifice their own life to save a royal? Let us know what you think of this, Mender's curse, below. The storm that followed was not one of snow, but of iron and fury. Theron Wolfheart, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, tore through the jagged brush of the dead zone like a landslide. His black fur was matted with the frost of a desperate 100-mile sprint. Behind him, the forest was a wake of splintered timber. He had expected to find a massacre, the remains of his son and the laughter of Shadowbane's assassins. Instead, he found a terrifying, holy silence. He skidded to a stop in the clearing, shifting to his human form before his momentum had even died. He was a titan of a man, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with a grief that hadn't yet found its voice. There, in the center of the violet-charred earth, lay the golden cub. Beside him, nearly covered by the rising drifts of the blizzard, was a woman. Finn. Theron's voice was a jagged raw thing. He lunged toward the cub, seeing the matted fur and the obsidian shards of the shattered trap. His son was breathing. The solar glow was back, stronger and purer than it had been since the day he was born. It was a miracle that defied every law of mana Theron knew. Then he saw her. The omen. Even half buried in snow, her pitch-black irises were unmistakable. Aurelia Darkwater, the girl his own edicts had condemned to the barrens. Rage, born of confusion and old prejudices, flared in his gut. He reached down to shove the cursed girl away from his son, his hand closing around her slim, frozen shoulder. The world vanished. The moment his skin met hers, the soul spark didn't just ignite, it detonated. It was an agonizing, beautiful roar that started in the marrow of his bones and tore upward through his heart. It was the sound of 1,000 stars collapsing into a single point of gravity. His inner wolf, usually a disciplined soldier, went to its knees in a fit of violent, possessive recognition. Mate. The word echoed through his mind with the force of a divine command. Theron recoiled as if burned, his breath hitching. He looked at his hand, then at the gray, bruised skin of the woman dying at his feet. She was the dark omen. She was the void-eyed freak. And she was the other half of his soul. You won't find the answers in her eyes, Theron. Not while they're closed. Evander Stonewood emerged from the shadows of the pines, his scholar's robes tattered and stained with travel. He looked at the king with a mixture of pity and grim admiration. I watched her do it, Evander said, his voice heavy with the weight of what he'd witnessed. She didn't just heal him. She gave him her immortality seed, the very core of the Void Mender's power. She poured her eternity into your son to fix the shards of his soul. Theron's heart plummeted. He knew the lore. The immortality seed was what allowed a Void Mender to survive the pain saturation. Without it, she was just a mortal omega, her body now a brittle vessel for 7 years of unbuffered agony. She was dying from a gift he hadn't asked for, a sacrifice made for a king who had signed her parents' death warrants. She has minutes, Evander warned. The dead zone is already claiming what's left of her. Theron didn't hesitate. He scooped Aurelia into his arms, her head falling back against his chest with a terrifying lack of weight. He grabbed the cub with his other arm, pulling them both against the heat of his body. He didn't look back at the clearing or the broken trap. As he began the sprint back toward the Sun Palace, his alpha aura flared, a sun-bright gold that turned the blizzard to steam. Behind him, the dead zone seemed to catch fire, the remnants of the violet trap exploding as the king's fury finally found its vent. He would move heaven and earth to save her, even if it meant burning down the very laws he had spent his life protecting. Theron just realized his fated mate is the very omen his laws sought to destroy. Do you think he'll choose his pack or his mate? Type pack or mate in the comments. The antiseptic scent of the Sun Palace infirmary was a sharp contrast to the iron tang of the dead zone. Aurelia's eyes fluttered open, but the world was a blur of gold silk and white stone. She expected the cold embrace of the void. Instead, she felt the agonizing weight of her own body. The pain saturation, no longer held back by her immortality seed, thrummed in her veins like liquid lead. She wasn't alone. Balthasar Grim-Walled stood at the foot of her bed, his face a mask of aristocratic disgust. He didn't offer a healer's touch. Instead, he signaled to the guards. The heavy rattle of cold iron chains filled the room as they shackled Aurelia's wrists to the bed frame. You are awake, Balthasar said, his voice dripping with icy venom. A pity. It would have been more merciful if the barons had finished you. Aurelia's voice was a dry rasp. The cub, is he? The prince lives, Balthasar interrupted, stepping closer. But at what cost? You are a soul mender, a void-eyed parasite. You didn't heal him. You performed a soul theft. You anchored your darkness to the royal line to forge a fake mate bond with the king. You have polluted the sun with the shadow, and for that, the purity edict demands your head. The palace courtyard was a sea of bared fangs and golden fur. The council had gathered in record time, their voices rising in a unified howl for blood. To them, Aurelia was the personification of every fear they harbored, a monster that had bewitched their king. Theron stood on the high balcony, his knuckles white as he gripped the stone railing. He saw the execution block being dragged into the center of the square, the heavy obsidian blade gleaming under the midday sun. "The law is absolute, Theron," High Alpha Balthasar shouted, gesturing to the cowering, shackled girl being pushed onto the block. "Execute the omen, or the pack will consider the wolf heart line forfeit. Choose your crown or this curse." Theron descended the stairs, his heavy boots echoing like thunder against the marble. The crowd fell silent as he stepped onto the execution block. He looked at Aurelia. She looked back, her pitch-black eyes filled with a weary acceptance that broke his heart. She wasn't afraid to die. She had been dying for 7 years. Theron didn't reach for his sword. In a move that shattered 1,000 years of Alpha tradition, the king dropped to his knees before the outcast. A collective gasp rippled through the thousands of gathered wolves. Theron took Aurelia's shackled hand and placed it firmly against his own throat, the ultimate gesture of submission, a position where even a mortal Omega could kill a king with a single squeeze. "If she is a curse," Theron's voice roared, carrying to the furthest corners of the palace walls, "then I am the monster that loves her. I will not rule a kingdom that demands the heart of the woman who saved it. If you want her life, you must take mine first." The silence that followed was deafening. Balthasar's face contorted in rage, but before he could speak, Theron reached into his tunic. He pulled out a heavy, wax-sealed parchment, the Purity Edict. With a flick of his wrist, he held it over a nearby torch. The fire climbed the paper hungrily, turning the laws of exile and execution into blackened flakes of ash that drifted over the crowd. The turning point had arrived. The king had burned the foundation of their prejudice, and as the last of the edict crumbled, he stood and unlocked Aurelia's chains himself. The era of the omen was over. The era of the mate had begun. The ashes of the Purity Edict still drifted in the air when Aurelia stood. Her legs were weak, her body a brittle shell of gray-bruised skin, but her void eyes had never been more focused. Balthasar Grim-Walled retreated, his hand flying to the hilt of his sword, his face twisted in the frantic terror of a man whose world of order had just been set ablaze. "Stay back, abomination," Balthasar hissed, the crowd of wolves watching in a paralyzed trance. Aurelia didn't reach for a weapon. She stepped toward the High Alpha with a slow, deliberate grace, her hand outstretched. She didn't strike him, she simply pressed her palm against his chest, right over his heart. The emotional purge began. In an instant, Aurelia opened the floodgates of her pain saturation. She didn't give Balthasar a physical wound, she gave him her memory. She let him feel 7 years of the souls he had discarded. He felt the bone-chilling cold of the dead zone, the agonizing hunger of exiled pups, and the crushing despair of parents watching their children wither under his purity laws. The weight of 1,000 strangers' torments rushed through Balthasar's veins like molten lead. The High Alpha didn't scream, he simply buckled. He fell to his knees, his eyes wide and vacant as he finally drowned in the ocean of suffering he had spent a lifetime creating. He was not killed by a blade, but by the sheer, unbuffered weight of the injustice he had authorized. The crowd watched in absolute silence as their supreme leader collapsed into a psychological ruin, a victim of the very pain he claimed didn't exist. The resolution was swift. Theron did not show the mercy the council expected. Thane Bloodclaw, the enforcer who had executed Aurelia's parents, and the remaining corrupt officials were stripped of their ranks. They were not executed. Instead, they were marched toward the border of the dead zone. They were exiled to the very wasteland they had created, forced to survive in the dust and the silence without the protection of the pack they had poisoned. Theron turned to Aurelia, the sun finally breaking through the clouds to catch the gold of his armor and the black of her eyes. He didn't offer her a gold crown or a title of nobility. He knew that for a woman who had carried the world's pain, the only reward was the power to end it. "I cannot give you back the years the dead zone took," Theron said, his voice reaching every wolf in the square. "But I will give you a kingdom that values the mending more than the marks." He established the Houses of the Mended, a network of sanctuaries and hospitals built on the sites of former execution blocks. In this reborn Darkwater pack, wolves with spectral deformities were no longer seen as omens of death. They were seen as the shield. The void eyes became a symbol of a protector, someone with eyes deep enough to see the hidden wounds and a heart strong enough to heal them. 20 years passed. The Sun Palace gardens were lush with life, the violet mana traps of the past nothing more than rusting museum pieces. A young girl sat beneath a willow tree, her white hair catching the light. She looked down at a small bird with a broken wing, her own pitch-black irises reflecting the creature's struggle. She reached out, her fingers glowing with a soft, steady gold, a blend of the solar power of her father and the void magic of her mother. As the bird's wing knit together and it took flight, the girl smiled. The cycle of pain was not just managed, it was broken. The omen had become the anchor, and the outcast had become the queen who taught a nation that the only true void was a heart without mercy. If you found Aurelia's journey from outcast to queen inspiring, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We have many more tales of fated mates and supernatural justice waiting for you. Leave a comment below. What would you do if you discovered your curse was actually your greatest gift? See you in the next story.